Welcome to the New York Outlook for Wednesday, the 21st of February 2024. Starting off with the economic calendar, there's one dreadful news event. However, it's after 9 p.m. or after our trading session rather, and is roughly 3 hours after the end of our trading session, so it has no bearing on our trading decisions for the New York session. Then moving on to the New York session. From a 4H perspective, I want to start here because there is something I actually forgot to mention in the London Outlook, although not particularly relevant at the time, but it's certainly relevant for the upcoming New York session, and that is perhaps just to do a quick overview. We have 4H bearish market structure that was recently confirmed. Then we had a pullback primary leg which achieved its objective of reaching the pro-trend extreme, and then obviously we had a pullback phase last point of supply failure, which then validated the pro-trend primary leg. However, at the same time, what we could understand is that an unconfirmed lower high swing point was created, and what I mean by that is that this is likely to be the swing lower high for the newly created lower low. Obviously, it's unvalidated until we actually body break this. However, what we can realize is that subsequent to the reaction to the pro-trend extreme, we then had the pro-trend primary leg develop and the primary OBs being validated associated with this pro-trend primary leg. And then from a substructure perspective, what we do know is that once we reach pro-trend extremes or we wick for its swing structure, we can validate a new substructure starting point, and from that sense I use this point to validate the latest substructure point. And then essentially, although this isn't really relevant, what is relevant is the low low lower high lower low, and what that essentially means is that in terms of this being validated as weak, in terms of my trading plan, an unconfirmed lower high is validated as weak when the 4H fully evidences that demand is in control, and what that means is that supply must fail and then demand must hold. And what we can see is that's exactly what happened. We had this OB right here which failed right there, and then from there we came into demand, and demand held by breaking the structure with a body break, which then means that demand is in control. And as a result of that, I created this unconfirmed primary unconfirmed primary leg, which has numerous primary unconfirmed OBs associated with it. What that essentially means is that it puts us in an unconfirmed scenario state, meaning that our objective is both to long and short. However, we need to trade within the parameters of the unconfirmed scenario. So not too long ago, if you recall, we were in this situation, and to trade within an unconfirmed scenario, we needed three factors, the one being 4H backing, the other being internal range liquidity available to target, and then a validated substructure on the 4 hour to target. Obviously, what we can see is yesterday, although this scenario wasn't valid yesterday, it only got validated after 4 p.m. yesterday. So what I mean by that is the swing structure, the substructure is validated because we have a valid 4H pullback visible on the 4 hour, and then obviously now for the London session we only had reasons to short. However, once we come into this 4H OB, once we do come into this 4H OB right here, then obviously our reasons for shorting become invalid because we're trading against this primary OB, and we will need to revalidate IRL in the current day in order to continue trading against this OB. What that essentially means is that once we reach this primary unconfirmed OB, there's reasons to both long and short. Obviously, once price comes into here, it's likely to be New York, and since we don't have any red folder news events to validate the New York low of the day, we'll essentially be done trading for the day, because in order to validate new IRL, we will need a new current high of the day, and that will require that the Asia high of the day is taken out. And for that to happen, of course, New York will need to put in a New York high of the day, and then again we don't have red folder news to validate why a New York high of the day should hold. So essentially, once we come to this area, we're pretty much done trading for today. What I do want to highlight, or perhaps before we go there, let's just see what the reason why I use this range OB right here instead of the extreme is because if we pay attention to this candle right here, you can see that it's the body and wicks, the high and low of this candle isn't body broken by any of the internal candles, and I thought it just makes a lot of sense to actually use it. Um, and then if we pay attention to what's happening here, there is a little bit of a window of imbalance right there, although extremely minor. So it's a bit judgmental as to whether you want to pay attention to it or not. But in my opinion, it looks quite insignificant, and I'd more so be focused on this area rather than this window of imbalance. Although thinking about my range rules, I require that there's at least more than 2 or 3 candles, and if I look within this candle, there's only one. So um, the valid primary OB is this. So perhaps it's worth considering that, given how far it is to consider. And then the other thing I did want to note is, if we consider that candle, you can see we body broke it here. So actually there's no valid range to support why using this range makes sense. So therefore there is this window of imbalance that's potentially worth considering, and what that essentially means is we're trading against a 4H OB, which then invalidates our shorts until we can revalidate new IRL. So on that premise, this trade right here that I have is invalid, so I'm going to remove that. And then, like I said, at the moment we've got this London low of the day, also to be validated. And for this to be validated, obviously New York will need to take it out. So I guess there is scope for both longs and shorts today. However, I believe all the IRL is used up because we've reached this 4H window of imbalance that we don't want to trade against. 4H window of imbalance, significant barrier, require IRL to be validated. Right, so that's pretty much the New York outlook. Perhaps to summarize, what we realized is that there's an unconfirmed lower high that was validated by 4H order flow, and by that we meant that 4H demand to control validating this is weak and likely targeted, because that essentially puts us in an unconfirmed scenario where there's both reasons to long and short. What we essentially can do is long and short for the New York session. However, there are a couple of factors to take into account. The first one being that there's barriers to trading short that we reached. The first being this window of imbalance that you can see right here, and because it's not body broken, we can't ignore it. And then in terms of the extreme, we have identified this pro-trend unconfirmed OP, and we've evaluated why it's not valid to use the range but the specific 4H OB. Then on the 5-minute, what are we waiting for the New York session? Essentially, shorts are off the cards because we reached this window of imbalance, and for shorts to be back on the cards, it would require that we body break this, at which point in time it's likely already the end of the day, and we probably reached majority of the daily range, but I guess not completely invalid, but a barrier to consider nonetheless. So perhaps what we can do is put a 4H substructure sort of line right here to tell us if the WUMB is invalidated. WUMB invalidated right there. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that longs can be valid in the sense that the London low of day could be validated when New York breaks the London range. The London range, which I can draw out right now, is roughly from this point to that point. So we can wait for that and essentially set an alert right here. Like I said, this order that I had is now invalid, so we'll monitor this, and this alert should tell us if the London low of the day is validated. Obviously, once it's validated, we can consider longs. Shorts are a bit more tricky. Like I said, we need to first validate that this Did we body break this without reaching this barrier? And then also we got to take into consideration if there is space for our daily range before we can consider additional shorts. So there's scope for both directions. It just requires a little bit of extra thought. Other than that, hope you have a good New York session, and we'll chat again for the end of day review.